All right, well, thank you all for coming today. This is Mike Lagerquist from Vine Faith in Action. We're here today with Matt Moore, a teacher in the Mankato Area Public Schools, who's going to talk a little bit about how they set the curriculum for the history classes in the district and what all of that entails. So I will step aside and let Matt take over.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Welcome to anybody who's watching the video recording of this. So my name is Matt Moore. I teach history at Mankato West High School, and just going to walk through kind of the roadmap I had envisioned for this presentation, and then I'll introduce myself. So my first objective here is to do introductions of myself. I'd also like to learn a little bit from you guys, and that leads into step two. Before I go too far into the weeds on curriculum, I would like to see of the audience, like what questions you're coming into this presentation with, and maybe I've already planned to answer them, or I'll know where to do deeper dives into some information along the way. And then step three would be to actually get into the meat of the X's and O's of teaching history in 2021, and then wrap it up with any other questions and answers after that. So I'll start by introducing myself. So I've been at Mankato West teaching social studies classes since 2011. Prior to that, I taught at Sleepy Eye Public Schools. That was my first teaching job. And I started there in 2007. And I grew up in South Dakota in a very small town called Redfield, South Dakota. If you've ever heard of it, it's probably because you know something about pheasant hunting. We're the claim to fame in Redfield was that we were the pheasant capital of the world. It was where the first Chinese ringneck pheasants were released. That kind of kickstarted the whole pheasant population in the Dakotas. So it's a small town. I graduated with a class of about 50 kids, and teaching in Mankato West, much different setting than what I grew up with, but I really like it there. I went to college at North Dakota State University. I did my bachelor's degree there. Met my wife there at Fargo, and then we both did grad school. I did grad school. I was lucky enough to get a James Madison Fellowship, which is scholarship through the federal government. So you get to do like half your grad school you get to do at Georgetown University, and then you complete your program at a university closer to home. So my degree is from the University of Minnesota, but did about half at Georgetown, half at the U of M. Got a master's degree at the U of M. My wife is a school counselor in the district. Her name's Jennifer, so she's pictured there. She works at Franklin Elementary. She's a counselor for elementary kids. And that's our daughter, Eloise, who just turned 6 a couple weeks ago. She's dressed up like her favorite American Girl doll there, which is what I'm discovering now is like, this is my path to teach my daughter history is through these American Girl doll books, and she's really getting into that. So that's her Mary Ellen doll, and Mary Ellen was a child of the 1950s. So she's learning all about the Cold War and Daytona Beach through Mary Ellen. That's our dog, Ruby. My wife got approved to have a therapy dog for the kids at Franklin. So Ruby is 1 year old, and I don't know, maybe another half a year or so, she'll do her testing for the therapy certification, and then my wife will take Ruby with her to work. So that's our family. We love it here in Mankato. It's a great school system. We both love working in it. And yeah, so right now I teach in the school district, I teach advanced placement United States history. So it is a US history class that students can earn college credit through by taking an advanced placement test at the end of the course. I also teach a couple of electives. I teach a sociology elective for, I should back up. The AP US history class is for 11th graders. The sociology elective is for 11th and 12th graders. And then I teach a controversial issues and debate class, and that's for 9th through 12th, all high school students there. How did I get into teaching? Why did I choose history? My grandparents, Roger and Dolores Moore, I think I'm at some high school function there, but my grandfather, Roger, he's a World War II vet, but he never talked about World War II. He wouldn't talk about World War II. He didn't share stories about it, but I knew a couple bits of information. I knew that he had had some close calls. I knew that there was a rumor that he had missed out on a Purple Heart. And so I'd always like grown up like wanting to ask him questions, but just never knowing how or the right way to ask questions. But what happened with me is I became very curious about his experience. And so I became kind of a World War II nerd, and trying to, because he wouldn't share information, I had to go out and read and find and dig. And I ended up learning a lot. And thankfully, before he passed away, I was able to track down, like I knew that he was in the 50th Signal Battalion, which is a group that would have been on the front lines for a lot of, like, most of the war in Europe. So if you know anything about the 101st Airborne, which is like the Band of Brothers story, his job was essentially 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, the 4th Infantry, the 9th Infantry were all part of something called 7 Corps. His job was basically connect those guys with their headquarters, 7 Corps headquarters. So he'd have to, wherever those guys were, he'd have to run out, him and his wire crew would have to run out, connect them back to their headquarters so that they could have telephone communication with the front line. So he was often having to go to the front line and back. And so he's involved in D-Day. He was involved in the Battle of the Bulge. He had a lot of close stuff going on there. Just a couple of years ago, I was able to figure out the root of the story of his close call with death, his almost Purple Heart. And I found it through some what are called morning reports, which is that visual there. What essentially would happen is that the group would have to, at the end of every day, commanding officer would write kind of what happened for that day. If anybody was sick, if anybody got injured. And in February of 1945, while they were in Eichweiler, Germany, they noted that there was that the command post was bombed, and that the enemy had dropped 4 bombs and it had injured 11 men in his company, and 9 of them were seriously wounded and had to be evacuated. And so I was finally able to like approach him with this and say, "Grandpa, tell me about Eichweiler, Germany." And he finally opened up. Like he finally would share information. He cried. He was 96 years old when he finally shared this information, but he finally shared. We tried to get him a Purple Heart. The story essentially was he had gotten injured along with pretty much everybody in his company had gotten injured to some extent. And a lot of the men got Purple Hearts, but you know, what happened was that a lot of the guys like lost limbs in this bombing. Nobody died, but a lot of people came close to death. So his injuries were minor in comparison. Like he didn't lose a limb, he had shrapnel. And so he felt like taking a Purple Heart would put him on the same level as some of these other guys. He was also worried he's sending money home to his mother and his had just died right before he went into the war, and so his mom was on edge. So he passed up on the Purple Heart at that moment in time, and his medical records burnt in a fire after the war. We're never able to get those medical records, but you know, I was able to find like this close call with death story and get him to finally open up about it. And so we have that now, thankfully. We have a recording of him telling the story of that. But once I was able to find specifics, he would start sharing. Like, and that to me, I think, is what the power of like history is. Like that's why I love this profession and why I grew to love the field of history. Is that there's a quote here I put in the slides from Sam Weinberg, who says, "Historical thinking teaches us to go beyond our own image, to go beyond our brief life. To go beyond the fleeting moment in human history into which we've been born. Of the subjects in the secular curriculum, it does the best in teaching those virtues once reserved for theology, the virtue of humility and the virtue of awe." Like, and so in the story of learning about my grandfather and all of his close calls with death in World War II, like that's what I felt. Like I felt humble, I felt awe, I felt how lucky am I to be alive, that this man had like 5 close calls with death even before he met my grandmother. And then was before my dad was born. And, you know, I think that like that's in its best form, like that's kind of what history teachers are trying to do with their students, is to help them gain some humility and gain some appreciation for the sacrifices of people have made in previous generations, right? So that's kind of my mantra going into the classroom. So that's a little bit about me and my path to where I got to be. I would like to learn a little bit about you. So first up, I want to know what your memories are of your history classes. So when you were going to elementary, middle school, high school, even into college, what do you remember about sitting in a history class? What was it like? Do you have any memories at all? And if so, what are they? So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share. And if you could just remind me of your name again real quick.
My name is Linda.
Linda.
I don't remember high school history as such. I don't know that it was taught. We had civics and that type of thing. I remember elementary learning, memorizing, dates and that type of thing. College, I'm sure I had to take one or two, and I don't remember very much about it.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed the civics. I don't know what you call it now.
Yeah, civics government, it's
Yeah.
usually you're going to see it called one of those two things in either school. So, all right, so memories of kind of the basic memorization. Anybody else?
I'm Mary,
Mary?
and thinking back, I don't remember much about the history classes that I took. My main memory of high school and civics class, I remember what room I was in when it was announced that Kennedy was assassinated.
Yeah. And I forgot to ask, Linda, you grew up where?
In Martin County, a little school, probably similar to what you
Okay,
graduated from.
and,
And my hometown was Barrett.
okay,
My class had 17 students in it.
they graduated together.
Yep.
And Mary, right?
Mary.
Okay,
I'm also married,
Mary,
and I grew up south of here in Amboy,
yeah,
in Door County, and in a class of 27. I do remember history class. I remember memorizing all kinds of dates and places and people's names and that type of thing. I remember that our history teacher was also our band director,
sure, yeah,
who was very interested, probably more so in current history than in past history, because we had a lot of current events.
Yeah.
We had to bring current events, and we'd spend a lot of the class discussing what was in the paper, because that was his favorite thing to do, was to read the paper. So
I didn't share what my experience was like. It was kind of similar to what you two had said. My history classes were very, just regurgitate this, here's a textbook, read this section, answer these 5 questions, we'll take a test. My government class was all that. It was basically current events. Like every day, somebody had to get up and present 3 current events, and then we take a quiz on these current events. And that's what my background was. Mike?
Thanks, Mike. I grew up here in Mankato. For me, the main thing was when you mentioned memorizing, that seemed to be a lot of it. But I think that's where I got my love of history. But just seeing how what came before us created the world we live in today. And to me, I always thought of them as facts, until I read a history of Blue Earth County from 1901, Thomas Hughes, and the way he described the situations with the Dakota, and realized that there is a point of view
Sure.
that can be reflected
Yeah.
very strongly in history. And I guess that I say that as kind of a lead in.
Yeah. So you don't often, when you ask people, like, what do you remember about history class? Or like whenever I'm getting my haircut or making small talk with people and they find out I'm a history teacher, I always usually it's the same conversation. It's the person sharing with me how much they hated their history teacher or how much they hated their history class. And yeah, so the memorization stuff that just, here's a textbook, go read it, that doesn't usually ever get many kids interested in history. And people who develop a love of history often will develop it after they leave high school. They'll develop it through reading nonfiction, engaging books, paperback and hardcover books. But so that's interesting. I wanted to just kind of see what the range of experiences was like before we go too far. And I've got 3 questions. My second question is, why do you think history classes should be required? So the state of Minnesota and almost every state in the country mandates, that students take a history class in order to graduate. They have to pass the history class to get a diploma. So I'm just wondering, what your feelings are about that. Why do you think we should require students throughout Minnesota to take a history class?
How can you discuss current events without knowing some of the history that influences that event? I think that's one of my
Yeah,
main
so
concerns.
I'll restate for the video. So Mary was saying that it's really hard to understand current events without some understanding of history. So
It's
really,
who we are.
what's that?
It's who we are or who we were.
You're part of a larger community. So me learning about my family gave me a deeper appreciation for my family, learning about my community, learning about whatever I'm a part of, a state, a nation. I'm going to gain a deeper appreciation about that. The more I
You
learn.
should go back to your quote. It should teach you a little humility.
Yeah.
And a lot of awe.
Yeah,
I mean, really.
hopefully, if done well.
Yeah,
Some days it works better than others.
I'm
But
glad you said
Yeah.
that.
yeah. Mary, any new other thoughts?
Yeah, I think we can't know what is going on right now if we don't know what happened, what
Yeah.
brought us to this point.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of questions we have right now that we need to know the background of
Yeah.
what happened.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of leads into my third question, which is, what questions do you have, coming into this presentation? What were any things you're hoping that I would touch on, or questions that I would answer at some point today? So if they're super short, I might be able to just answer them right now, or I can tell you I've already planned a good response to that. I can answer that further down the road. Mike,
I'm
you have
just
one?
wondering why it became so politically charged. Like I say, it used to be facts. It used to be the context against which we, gauge today's activities. And now it seems like you don't even know what happened
Yeah.
because one person says this, one person says that.
So a little bit about the current context. I do have a plan to address that.
And what Mankato's actually presenting, and when the last time that you, not you personally, but the district decided what the curriculum would be.
Sure, I can get into that.
Then, because what I remember learning in history class was American history.
Yep.
I don't remember learning local history.
Oh, yeah.
Do you teach local history?
So
Background to this?
I will address kind of what's going on at all the various grade levels, and I definitely will answer that. But I'll try to go a little bit more in depth when I get to that point. So I think I will plan on answering all those questions. Are there any others that you want me to tackle along the way? If there's others that pop up as I'm going, I just interrupt me. And okay, so a little bit about what it's like teaching history right now here in Mankato West High School. This is just what is being taught at the high school level, right? So at 9th grade, students in our high school take a world history class that covers everything from the dawn of mankind to the present. And then in 10th grade, students have a choice. They can take a human geography class one semester, and a US history class that covers first half of US history. When I say first half, I should, well, I did put some dates in there. So like pre-Columbus, so Native American, what was North America like prior to Columbus, up to Reconstruction right after the Civil War, right? Or if a student decides that they kind of want to get on like a college pathway, they can take an AP class their 10th grade year. It's called AP Human Geography.
What is human geography?
What is human geography? Yeah, so if your geography class was like mine in high school, I don't know if you took a geography class, but for me, it was just like maps and memorization. Where's a country? And there is still some regional geography. That's what we would call today, that type of geography is regional geography. What, where are things? That's still happening at more of an elementary, middle school level, but at the high school level, the geography that is embedded there, it's called human geography. And what that does is it takes a look at the world as it is today through a variety of themes. So one theme would be agriculture, right? So you would look at agriculture patterns throughout the world. And you might look at ag in Minnesota, but you might also make some comparisons to agriculture in South America, and Africa, and Asia. And that, so you would have an ag unit. You would have a population unit, and you'd be learning about population density and how does population increase in some places. And so you're looking at theories of geography there. If you want to, I can go later on. I can pull up the standards and I can kind of show you what a human geography class would look like. But it's way beyond just learning about memorizing things on a map. So it's kind of trying to understand why the world is the way it is today. So
There are textbooks for it? or-
there are a lot of textbooks out there for human geography. Yeah. So they use it, and they would use one in this class. For the 11th grade, it's U.S. history. So either if they took the standard U.S. history here, they pick up where they left off in 11th grade, or if they're kind of going the AP route, then they have the AP option, which is what I teach at the 11th grade. And since a lot of these kids who took AP Human Geo, they didn't sit in this U.S. history class. So my AP U.S. history class goes back to 1491, and we cover the whole, 1491 to the present in my AP U.S. history class. And then in their 12th grade year, the students would take either a semester of government, civics, and a semester of econ, or they could take AP versions of those classes. So AP government, AP econ, we offer those classes. So AP stuff, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but for right now, it's not a guarantee that a student is going to get college credit, but it is going to be a much more rigorous, intense, more reading, more homework, more college level. The textbook is different than what the kids would be getting it'd be a college textbook that they'd be getting. So they'd be doing a lot more writing in those classes. So it's more work. Kids know that going into it.
So would they take the AP, is it a full year of each of those, the AP government and AP
Yeah.
economics?
So they would take a full year of AP government. Now, here's what this government teacher knows, that these kids have likely are skipping their econ content, right? So what this AP government teacher will do is embed the econ standards into their class, knowing that they're not going to be in that regular econ class. And then this AP econ teacher would do the same. So let's say there could be a kid who does both AP Gov and AP Econ concurrently. By the time they're a senior, they often have they're often, if they're an AP kid, they probably only need a couple more credits to graduate. They got a lot of options open in their schedule. And so a lot of these kids would take both of those AP classes, but some kids would just take one. So let's just say they just sign up for AP Econ. That econ teacher is going to embed government content into their class to make sure they're not missing out on that material. So that's kind of a brief overview there. So most of what I wanted to talk about today is just kind of the guidelines of what parameters does a teacher walk into a classroom with? You know, what governs us? Where do we have very firm rules in place, and where do we have a little bit of flexibility and looseness? So I'm going to talk about four things that exert influence on any teacher in the school district. So one would be state standards. Those are up for review and those get to be rewritten every 10 years, which is happening right now as we speak. The second thing I'll address is some national frameworks that are in place that would govern some classes, not all social studies classes. The third thing would be specific to our school district, ISD 77, curriculum, textbooks, policies. I'll talk about those. And then the fourth and final thing would just be building norms, things happening just within one school building, Mankato West or Mankato East. All right, so a little bit of background on state standards. These are in the news right now. So they get updated every 10 years. So there are no national social studies standards. There was an attempt to create them back in the 90s. And there was a historian named Gary Nash who led that. He just died last week. He was American Revolution was his specialty. He was a UCLA professor. And then there was a big backlash against those national standards, and they ended up dying. They ended up not being funded by Congress. It was Dick Cheney's wife, Lynn Cheney, who kind of led the charge against them. She, at the time, I think, was in charge of the National Endowment for the Humanities, or one of those national arts organizations. But that's the last time it's ever been attempted on a national level. So in terms of social studies, it's a patchwork across this country. Each state develops their own standards. Some are incredibly specific. Some are incredibly vague. And if you, I don't have a screenshot of this, but if you ever wanted to go online and just do, like, is there one spot I can go where I can compare all of them? There is an organization called the Thomas Fordham, Fordham. I can't remember if it's Institute or if you just Google Thomas Fordham Social Studies Standards, what they usually do every 4 or 5 years is they'll publish a report where they go through and they give a grade to each state's social studies standards. They have an agenda, they have an opinion, they have a bias, they want to see social standards be a certain way. And so they'll evaluate them along those lines. But in their report, they usually do a nice job of summarizing the trends within each state. Minnesota is, I think they gave Minnesota a B grade as being not too vague, but they were hoping for a little bit more specifics. And each state then decides how often they want to update their standards. So like the state of South Dakota is also updating theirs right now. They update theirs every 7 years. Minnesota updates theirs every 10. And so Minnesota's were last updated in 2011. And then they often have kind of a pretty big window of time of like when they're written versus when they have to be fully implemented. So usually they give school districts a couple years to be like, okay, so this is the final draft of the standards. You now have 2 or 3 years to put these in place. Now there's no standards police. So there's nobody from the Department of Ed, State Department of Ed, who is the social studies police officer who goes around to school districts and walks into some teacher's room and verifies that they're teaching the standards. It's up to building principals to essentially govern this. So a building principal could say to a teacher, you're not teaching the state standards, and that would be grounds for, you could then remove a teacher for they're not doing the job. So there is no standards police. And then the other thing to maybe understand is there's no state test to check in to make sure kids are knowing all of the benchmarks or meeting all of the objectives in the state standards. Some states have that. I'll come back to the testing in just a minute, but in 2011, this is what the state of Minnesota came up with for the standards. So this is a complex chart, and the way to look at this is you got grades across the top. So K would be kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and then 9 through 12 over here. And then the colors represent various subjects. So kindergarten, what do they get in kindergarten? They're going to get a mixture of all the various social studies. So it's not like they're taking a history class in kindergarten. What they're getting is a mixture of government and civics, history, economics, geography, and they're getting a little mixture of that in first grade, second grade, third grade. In fourth grade is where we start to see the state, in 2011, the state of Minnesota basically said to all the schools across the state, like, in fourth grade, you should have your social studies class, you call it whatever you want, but your social studies class should focus on the geography of North America. Right, so it will have a little bit of history and economics and civics, but it's primarily, most of the standards there are going to be geography standards. All right, and then in fifth grade, it's going to be mostly a history class. So it's going to be a history of North America up to 1800. So it's going to deep dive on Native Americans, on explorers, on the colonial era and the rise of slavery, and up to the American Revolution, right? So that would be fifth grade. Sixth grade, and you had a question earlier about like local history. Sixth grade is where they do the deep dive on local history. So most schools will call that sixth grade. They'll tell the kid, you're taking a Minnesota history class, or you're taking a Minnesota studies class. There is a textbook published by the Minnesota Historical Society called Northern Lights, which almost every school across our state will probably use, because there's not many other textbook publishers out there who are trying to develop a Minnesota history textbook, since it's really only marketable in this state. So you have a Northern Lights textbook that a lot of teachers will use there. Seventh grade will be mostly history. It'll be U.S. history focused. It'll pick up where this fifth grade left off. So it'll go 1800 forward to the present, right? So Civil War and World War is there. Eighth grade is what they call it a global studies class. It's mostly geography, right? So that would be in eighth grade. And so the state of Minnesota was very firm, like prior to 2011, the state of Minnesota had given school districts flexibility on when to cover this stuff. So some schools were teaching Minnesota history in fifth grade, some were doing it in sixth grade, some were doing it in seventh grade. And in 2011, the state said, you are going to teach Minnesota studies, Minnesota history in sixth grade. That's where it needs to happen. So this is often why they would give a school district a couple years to make sure that these are implemented. And then, but in 9th through 12th grade, they give districts flexibility. So they say, we're going to have, you need to have civics and government, you need to have econ, you need to have geography at the high school level, you need to have US history, you need to have world history. We don't care where you put it, but they did say, based on the number of standards, your US history class should be at least a year long. You shouldn't squeeze all of US history into a semester. Your world history class should be a year long. It's okay if your civics and gov is only a semester. It's okay if your econ is only a semester. It's okay if your geography is only a semester. So these classes would have half the amount of standards as these classes would have. So these ones have roughly, like, I should use the proper benchmarks is what the state would call them. So these classes would have something like 50, some 60 benchmarks. These classes would have 20 to 30 benchmarks that they were meant to have. So when you hear, maybe you have grandchildren, relatives who are in high school, and you're comparing notes, one 9th grader in this, wherever they're at in this state, would be taking maybe civics, a government class, and in Mankato, a 9th grader is going to be taking world history. So there is not an agreed upon what we would call scope and sequence across the state for that. Some states, Minnesota's not one of them, but some states would be very specific on what has to be taught in what year. Pros and cons to that. The pros would be it allows for a little bit more collaboration. So now that all these Minnesota studies teachers are all teaching 6th grade, it's a lot easier for them to share material. Knowing that we all kind of roughly have the same age group that we're incorporating. But for the high school level, it's a bit flexible. And then here's what the standards will look like. So these are 2011 standards. And then this is what still governs our school district right now. So there are revisions being made to the standards. Right now they're in their 2nd draft and they're soliciting feedback on the 2nd draft. They're probably going to do a 3rd draft and get feedback on a 3rd draft. So it would be, I would estimate it would be probably 2 or 3 more years before, even if the standards are finalized right now, it would be 2 or 3 more years before those standards are like enforced, implemented, put in place in Mankato Public Schools. But so for until then, we're using, these 2011 standards and benchmarks. So on the far left, they have the suggested grade level. So you see 9, 10, 11, 12 there. And then they have the strand. And so this would either say history or civics or geography. Substrand, so if it says history here, it might say United States history, or it might say world history. And then the standard is here. They have a code. Teachers use these codes to put in lesson plans. And then they have a benchmark. So you got standards and you got benchmarks. What matters to a teacher is the benchmark. The benchmark is often going to be way more specific than the standard. This is really often going to tell me like, what should I be doing with my lesson plan? So I've just picked 2 random ones here from US history. So like this one here says, describe the implications of United States involvement in World War I on domestic foreign policy. All right, so I know that means in my US history class, I should make sure that when I get to the end of World War I, we talk about a kid in my class should be able to explain, here's how the United States changed its foreign policy after World War I. And then this other one here, analyze the economic causes of the Great Depression and the impact on individuals, communities, institutions. What I do want to draw your attention to is notice how the language is still a little bit vague. So we do need to make, whatever public school you drop into in the state, if it, in a US history class, they should be addressing the causes of the Great Depression. But the way this is written, teacher would have a little bit of flexibility on like what causes should I focus on? Do I want to focus on the Federal Reserve policies? Do I want to focus on the weakness of the banking system? Do I want to focus on overproduction in the farming sector? I could do all of them, or I could just do a couple. The way that that's written gives a teacher a little bit of flexibility. So backing up, I'm not going to read these out word for word, but what you should notice is that the standards are a lot more vague. These over here are very vague. These over here are more specific, but there still is a little bit of vagueness within them.
What does the Mankato department like to see? Would you like all more specific, or do you all like the vague?
Well, later on, I was going to talk about challenges that a history teacher would run into.
Okay.
That's a challenge, and I will talk about some of the tug of war that happen within that. The quick answer would be there's pros and cons. So the vague thing allows me to have some agency. Maybe I am a super nerd about the Federal Reserve, and I really want to get into like monetary policy in this Great Depression lesson. I could. That is not stopping me from doing that. Whereas I'm not that. My Federal Reserve knowledge is shallow compared to my knowledge on some of the other causes of the Great Depression, and I would spend more time on the other causes. So I like that this gives me the flexibility to do that. On the other hand, there are some topics that you or I might feel passionate about. And it's like, how could you not say that I know that this thing is the most important cause of this event, and I want it spelled out in there because I want every Minnesota kid to know that. So you get into some battles like that. Okay. Backing up just a second though, I do want to point out So one of the things that you saw, the Minnesota social studies standards, you know, there's some groups throughout the state that are trying to draw attention to them. And there was a first draft that was released like last December, and that had several months where they opened up periods of time where people could provide feedback on those standards. And so there was a group, the Center for American Experiment was going around the state, encouraging people to, you know, drawing their attention to certain aspects of the standard and say, you know, file a feedback form and draw attention to this. What was happening with the release of the first draft of the revised possible standards, they'd only released standards. They hadn't even come up with benchmarks yet. So one of the things that the Center for the American Experiment was telling people was that you need to be concerned that students are not going to learn World War I. They're not going to learn about World War I in the new revised social studies standards. Well, look at the 2011 standards. World War I is mentioned over here, but it was not mentioned over here. You know, so if you had gone back and looking at the 2011 standards, it would have been the same thing. And so what people on the Standard Development Committee were trying to say back to the Center for American Experiment people was, it's not in there, it will be in there. Like, we're getting there. Like, we haven't got there yet. We haven't got to the point of doing the specific examples yet. We're just doing the big, broad, overarching ideas at this point. So I can talk a little bit more about the American Experiment thing in just a second. I said earlier, there was a thing about there's no test in the state of Minnesota. Some states do that. The state of New York requires all of their public school students have to pass a civics and US history exam, get a passing score on that in order to graduate high school in the state of New York. I think Texas might also. So Minnesota does not, and it is outlawed in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota has explicitly said in their statutes, like, the Commissioner of Education is not allowed to develop a statewide assessment for social studies, for health and physical education, and the arts. We do have statewide assessments for math, for reading, and for science. We do not have one for social studies. And the state of Minnesota has said you cannot develop one for the state.
Why did they say that?
Why? It's a political minefield. Like, look what's happening right now with the standards. So going back to what you said earlier, like, this is, historians will refer to it as the history wars. Like, every so many years, there's a big battle over history. And sometimes it's, in the 90s, it was, what is the Smithsonian Museum of Air and Space going to say about Hiroshima? That had really ignited a lot of passionate debate across the country. In the 90s, there was also the battles over national standards, the idea of national standards. And anytime anybody sits down and says, here's what students should learn about history, it's just like battle. People are very passionate about what they think students should be learning, and they have a hard time finding areas of agreement on that. Yeah.
I would think that it would be really easy to sway people's thinking about different things just by what you teach. I mean, by what a teacher can teach.
I would, yeah. Like, I know there's been a lot of concern. Like, I've heard that sentiment parents have been addressing that concern in front of the school boards, and I know we have a lot of power to influence opinions, but these kids, especially at the high school level, are incredibly independent. You know, I wish I could brainwash them, because then they would get their homework done.
Yeah.
I would brainwash them to remember to bring their device to class every day and have it fully charged and have a pencil. So by the time I get a kid in my class, my ability to get them to agree with me on every issue is, it's not going to happen. These are high school kids, and they're, you know, the way their brain is functioning at that time is often they walk in intent to disagree with you on whatever you're going into the classroom with. But there is, yeah, that's another concern, is like, if we put this on the test, then that is going to be, you know, every teacher throughout the state is going to have to hit that thing, and kids, whether they agree with it or not, are going to have to answer that question that way on a test. So
these states that have the tests.
Yeah.
If they don't say, I don't know if they do it in 9th or 10th grade, if they don't pass it, do they just keep taking it until they do?
Yes,
So they just keep taking
they
the
keep,
same
they keep
test?
taking it. The hope would be that the school district would provide them with more support and be like, let's try to reteach this. Let's put you in this summer class and try to get you a quick refresher on this before you do your next attempt.
But don't the AP classes in Minnesota require tests?
So yeah, let's get into that. So now let's talk about the national framework. So there are organizations out there that have attempted to create a national exam for U.S. history for all the kids throughout the country to take. And it's the College Board, and it is the AP US History exam, which my students take every year, right? And the test change every year.
Is that just the AP classes or all of your history classes?
No, so, I mean, technically any kid can sign up for any AP exam. But if they don't take the AP class, they're not gonna pass that exam. They're not gonna get the score they need to get a college credit. So there are two entities that I would say have attempted to create some national framework for social studies throughout the country. And so the first would be the College Board, but this would only impact AP US history courses. This would not impact a regular US history class. And then the Common Core, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the Common Core before, but they have what are called literacy in history standards. Now, it was not required that every school district adopt these. It was up to states to decide. The Common Core was put together by the National Governors Association, which is, if you know anything about the political landscape of the United States, mostly Republicans. So it was this mostly Republican organization that said, we're falling behind the rest of the world in terms of reading and writing and math and science. And so we think, and they're kind of like in line with what the Thomas Fordham Institute argument was, that standards are too vague, standards are too weak. We want to increase rigor, we want to increase standardization. And so they put together, this was maybe 10 years ago, some benchmarks that they encouraged. Nobody forced this on the states, but they encouraged states to adopt more stringent standards for writing, for reading, for math. And the state of Minnesota adopted some of them, okay? So the state of Minnesota adopted literacy standards that would impact social studies teachers. And so I'll show those. Actually, let's take a look at those right now since I'm talking about it. And I'll come back to AP. Right, and so the whole point was like they thought kids there's not enough kids in the country ready for college, ready for career. And so in a social studies class, shouldn't a kid be reading and writing, right? That's kind of the idea behind these standards. So they were trying to spell out, like, in a high school history class, and I know the font on that is tiny. I'm just gonna maybe point out a couple of bullet points, just give you examples of what these things say. So here are reading standards. And so these are saying things like a kid should be able to figure out, if you give them a newspaper article, they should be able to figure out the main idea, the central idea of that article. They should be able to summarize the key ideas of that. They should be able to assess how point of view shapes the content. So I'm looking at an editorial from the Atlantic magazine. What do I know about the Atlantic magazine? I'm looking at an op-ed that was published on Fox News Online. What do I know about Fox News? Kids should be able to start thinking about point of view and how that might shape whatever they're gonna, think about that before you read. Right, so that's kind of like what reading suggestions they had, and then writing over here, they all kind of come up with, like evidence-based arguments. A kid, so the saying I teach a debate class, the saying I have for my debate students is that opinions are like belly buttons. Everybody has one, but some hold more water than others. And we want our opinions to hold water. So we want our arguments to be evidence-based. If you make a claim, we got to find some good evidence to support that claim. And that's like, we want to help kids get better at that in writing. And we can do that in a government class, we can do that in an econ class, we can do that in geography, we can do that in history. And so that's what the Common Core, in terms of reading and writing, that's what they were suggesting, that there be more of that. There should be more reading, should be more writing happening in these social studies classes. So, the state of Minnesota did adopt these. And so again, it's on principals to make sure that this is happening in the social studies classes in their buildings. Okay, backing up then to the AP, to the College Board. So what does the College Board do? So they have a pretty specific, like, they used to be very vague, but in about 2015, they revised a lot of their curriculum, and they try to be a lot more specific with kids. So I've shown you a Great Depression benchmark earlier from the state of Minnesota. So here's what the College Board, for me, AP US History, these are probably the first thing I'm gonna look at as a teacher, even before I go to the state standards. I'm gonna look at, what is the College Board telling me I need to teach kids? Because it might show up on the test, right? There is a test that I know my kids are going to want to do well on because they're trying to get college credit. So I need to make sure what do they need to know? And so they say, well, you should be teaching Great Depression, the learning objective. Kids should be able to explain the causes of the Great Depression and the effects. And then they get a little bit more specific. They spell out in key concepts, here are some more specific things like you should get into in your class. And by spelling this out, these are all liable to be on the exam. And so they have 170 of these things over here. Any one test is never going to hit everything that they spell out. But I have to make sure I cover that stuff and that the kids retain some memory of that by the end of the year, because they only get one shot at that test. You know, they take that test in May. They take it in one sitting. It is 55 multiple choice questions like this. And these are different than the multiple choice tests like you took and I took. These are what they call stimulus based. So the students have to read, they read a primary source first. This is a quote from President Calvin Coolidge in 1925. And then they're answering like 3 questions about that quote. And it's often like, what is Coolidge reacting to? It's 1925, you got to read into this a little bit. You got to know what's going on in the 1920s. And then the next question down, members of which of the following groups would have been most likely to agree with Coolidge? All right, so in this debate about how aggressive should the federal government be in the economy, who's likely going to agree with Coolidge that the government should take a hands-off approach? Kids have to have working knowledge of that. And then this last question, ideas expressed in this excerpt were most similar to the ideas of which of the following. So here a kid should go, all right, Coolidge is like hands-off. Where else did we have kind of an era where there was at the national level like a push to have less federal government regulation? And then they would go, oh yeah, 1980s conservatives, Reagan. So that's a lot of thinking that has to be done on just a multiple choice test. And then after they do 55 multiple choice questions, they do 3 short answer questions, then they do a long essay question, and then they do an even longer essay that they call a document-based question. So it's a 4-hour test. They get one shot at it in May. All of their writing gets shipped off to be graded by human beings who sit down and grade their writing, and all that gets computed into a score, and that score determines whether they got college credit or not.
Do the kids like this though? I'm
They,
sure some do, some don't, but on the whole.
I think, I guess we try to, again, they're teenagers and they're not, they don't have that long-term thinking yet. So we try to advise them when they're signing up for classes in the spring. All right, don't overdo it on AP classes. So you could fill out your schedule with AP classes, but they're going to be intense. There's going to be a lot of homework. So sign up for AP classes of subjects that you're really interested in, because you don't want to, you don't want me to be giving you all of this reading on Calvin Coolidge when you hate history. Like that's going to be a very, it's going to be a long year. But so I'd say for the most part, the kids I get in my class they either love history or they might not like history, but they're very motivated. They're very driven. They know they want to go to college. They want to do well on the exam. And so they, Mr. Moore, just tell me what I need to do. I'll do the homework. Just give me what I need to do to do well on this. So there is one organization that has attempted to do a national exam. And I would say it's been pretty, like, you probably haven't heard much about it. It's avoided controversy. For the most part, it has avoided the political minefields of a lot of the other history wars. So the test changes every single year. It's a new test. You know, I have to cover everything from Native Americans before Columbus up to the present. And so there's a lot to do in that class. So anyway, and then the third thing that a teacher needs to be mindful of is what the school district has come up with. What Mankato has come up with is different than maybe what Sleepy Eye is going to come up with, right? So in Mankato, going back to your geography thing, like, here's an example of what the geography teachers did. So the geography teachers sat down with the state standards and the benchmarks. I told you earlier, like, how some of these benchmarks are a little vague. So it says, analyze the economic causes of the Great Depression, but it doesn't tell me specifically which causes I should be focusing on. I'm gonna have a textbook that probably will spell those causes out. I could use what the textbook gives me, but maybe I just read a new book that argues that there's this new cause that nobody else has thought about yet. And maybe I'll bring that in my class. So anyway, what teams of teachers will do in our school district is sit down and develop kind of a grand unified document where they will go through the class like one unit at a time, start with the standards that the state has given us, and really get into a lot of detail on, like, okay, what are we actually going to do with that? What's that going to look like in our class? So this is the human geography teachers. This is their ag unit, and so they came together as a team, and they were like, here are all the big questions we want to tackle in this agriculture unit. And so we want students to know, where do you find large-scale commercial agriculture and agribusiness? How is food production and consumption interdependent? What are the rural settlement patterns? What is von Thunen's model of agriculture, and how does it apply to land use practices in agricultural production? So these are like big questions that they're going to use as the focus of their lesson plans. They have a document where they spell out, here are, like, what are the facts we want kids to know in this unit? What are the skills we want them to be able to do? So if a kid might be asked to identify agribusiness and the role that they play in agricultural production, explain conflicting points of view that are associated with the Green Revolution. So those are things kids are going to be able to have to do there. Then they've linked learning activities. So these are like lesson plans or videos that they think are going to be good for this unit. Vocabulary. We're going to have students come into this class who are English language learners. What are some probably big terms that we should make sure we address? It's going to be in the textbook. Not many people know what this term means. We should probably make sure we think about this before we teach this. Extra resources here that they share, adaptations, learner adaptations. So that's where they could say, all right, we've developed this regular test, but we also have this alternative test for a student on an IEP or a 504 plan or an English language learner. We have an alternative there. All right, so you asked, like, how frequently does this happen in the school district? I would say it's ad hoc. So it is when those standards get revised, we're going to need to do this for all of the kindergarten, first grade, second grade. All of the classes are going to need to do all of it. And we can sit down with our old document and tweak it and adjust it. But then you also will have instances like, for me, an AP US history teacher, where in 2015 the College Board updated their curriculum, and they said we're gonna change the way we test students. And so, we were able then, AP US history teachers were able to sit down and say, we need to go through this process again because our curriculum has changed. So the state standards haven't changed, but the AP US history standards have changed. So I would say bare minimum, this is going to happen once every 10 years. That might happen more frequently. Before we can ever roll out a new class, if we wanted to offer a new elective, we need to go through this whole cycle. And so we're supervised when we're doing this. So it's mostly teachers, social studies teachers who would do this, but there would also be people from admin from downtown, our curriculum director who would oversee this. We would also have like special ed people work with us on this, who are constantly thinking about things from the point of view of a special ed student. English language learner teachers would be invited to be part of these teams. Again, thinking about how are you gonna, here's some things to think about when you have an English language learner student in your class with this unit. So these are often very collaborative, and we would do this, the team has a choice of doing this in the summer, or you can kind of do this throughout the school year and meet sporadically throughout the school year. Most teachers, I think, pick the summer option, and they often will just set aside a couple weeks and really, you know, this is going to be our full-time job for 2 weeks. We're just going to focus on this, updating the curriculum here. So that, anyway, so when we hire a new teacher, we can give them this. Or even, you know, if I'm not teaching in human geography right now, but let's say I'm asked to do that next year. Like, this is the first thing that I'm going to want to look at. I could go back and look at the standards and benchmarks again, but I know that the people I work with have already done that, and they've broken them down, and they've spelled out, and you know, here's really what I need to focus on for that class. So I would say the other big thing that needs to happen at that meeting is, especially between the east and west sides of town and central, the alternative school, we need to be in agreement on like what our units are and our pacing. So that if a kid transfers from east to west, from west to east, or just within the building, if they at the semester point switch from me to another US history teacher, that they're roughly going to be at the same point, that they're going to pick up where we left off on. So we kind of need to have agreement on where are we going to be at the end of the first quarter, where are we going to be at the end of the second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. That's usually the big thing, the first thing you kind of argue about as a team.
So when you establish this, is this teachers from all those schools together doing it?
Yes.
It isn't like West doing theirs and East doing theirs and then saying, so they're always.
Ideally, we want to get as many voices involved as possible, ideally. Now, there are some situations where a teacher from one school said that they're going to be able to participate. A family thing came up and they were not able to be part of the team. And we would, you know, they were maybe not attending all those meetings. But the other thing is, these things are not written in stone when they're, so in this school district, we do monthly, they call them PLC meetings. They're the late start days. And so once a month, we get to group up. So I would meet with the other AP US history teacher at East. So we meet once a month for 2 hours. And what we could do at that meeting is make updates to this. And so we could say, I just read an amazing book over the summer about the Great Depression. It totally blew my mind. There's these new things I want to make sure that we teach. I've got a great new source that I want to use. When I get to that unit, let's make an update to this document. And so the team will frequently revisit this, like especially when a class is newer, they're going to revisit this quite frequently. If it's a class that's been around and functioning for a while, then things kind of are not, they wouldn't pull this document back up as much. Okay. All right, so there would be, all right, so then the other, just a policy that's going to be important this year especially, we have a controversial topics policy in the school district that says, you know, for controversial issues, we have to make sure that we're doing a balanced presentation of that, and that we have to remain neutral on that controversial topic. So, like, that's something else that a teacher in this school district needs to be aware of. That they, you know, if you bring a speaker in, if you bring a guest speaker in, like, and they're going to talk about a controversial topic, and it will be approved by the building principal. So that's something else a newer teacher would need to be aware of. From there, then you have like the building norms. And I might give a different Great Depression test to my students than the teacher at East would give. You know, we both have the same end goal, like we both want our kids to get to the same objective, but we might have a couple different ways of getting there. But within a building, what you will often have is teachers using pretty similar assessments. And if that's happening, then those teachers are often, you know, in tight communication with each other on like, when are you giving your tests? So that, you know, we don't want your classroom taking the test a day ahead of time and then your kids are leaking the answers to my kids. So within a building, then there often will be a lot of collaboration, more collaboration than with teachers teaching the same thing, so that they're, you know, they're on the same page, they're roughly at the same point. So there's a lot of collaboration there that's happening. All right, so that's kind of a little bit of background on like all of the frameworks that are in place for a teacher here in Mankato Public Schools. Before I get to the challenges, were there any questions you had about that thus far?
When they establish those standards.
Yeah.
It's done like once every 10 years.
Yep.
Can they end up being like politicized by, I mean,
Yeah.
if whoever's in power kind of loads up the Department of Education to be their thinking, they're the ones that establish the standards, right?
So the Commissioner of Education will call for a committee to be formed. So right now there is a committee of people, and to be on the committee you would apply, and the Commissioner of Ed would have a say in the committee. So that could be a political, they could make, but what I've seen in my experience in this round and in the last round, I've not seen a major political move there where somebody was like making a blocking, you know, conservatives or liberals in any case. So it's essentially, it's like, there's, you know, what you're generally going to see are professionals in the field. So professors of history from the University of Minnesota, professors of geography, people with PhDs in this economics and government. And then you're going to have teachers who, you know, that this is their career, that they've made a career out of this. They've often have taught 15, 20, 25 years and, you know, have a pretty good feel for what a sixth grader is capable of, what a third grade, you know, a PhD at the U of M might have some idea for what history should look like at the third grade level, but probably want a third grade teacher there too to say like, okay, but pump the brakes on that idea here real quick. Like, here's what a third grader could do. So I think, I cannot remember the exact number, but I think this year there's somewhere in the range of, I know it's more than 40. It's somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 people are on a team, or on the curriculum team. That then they'll break out into like an econ team, a US history team, a civics government team, geography team. And so they would collaborate to develop a draft. They push the draft out. They try to get feedback on the draft. So in pre-COVID times, they would often tour the state and they would have regional meetings throughout the state. This year they did Zoom meetings, and you know, they get feedback. The feedback is then shared with the group. All of this was recorded and anybody could sit and watch these meetings this year. And so the group gets the feedback, they make updates. So we have a second draft. Like they've got a finished product and they could keep doing redrafting if they wanted to. But when they feel like, I would guess maybe after a third draft, they'll send it to the Commissioner of Education, who then has the option of approving or rejecting and then starting the whole process over. And so it could call for a whole new team of people. I don't know if you follow the news in South Dakota, but just a quick comparison. In South Dakota, the headline over the weekend was the committee had reached an agreement on a draft and they had submitted the draft And then a draft was published to the state, but it was way different than the draft that they had submitted. And so people on the committee leaked their draft, to news organizations in the state. And so if you go on any South Dakota news outlet, Argus Leader, Keloland News, that's one of the headlines you're going to see right now, is that somebody in their state Department of Ed took that draft and made some serious changes to it and then pushed it out. I've never seen that happen in Minnesota. So yeah, and there's, then there's political pressure that can exert itself on the Commissioner of Education. So when the drafting's all done, there could be a push to try to influence their decision one way or another on approving or disapproving of it.
Is it more just in your department, the histories is it more just like in the histories and the geography departments rather than in well, probably English would have a lot, but in the math, that wouldn't have as much?
Yeah, for some reason, people get the most worked up about history standards. Nobody cares about the geography, even within the social studies, nobody's getting worked up about the geography standards.
Yeah.
It's the US history stuff that gets people to argue. The math thing sometimes, like you probably heard about, if you've heard about Common Core, it was because of the controversy surrounding the suggested math standards. And so maybe you've heard people express outrage that math is so much different now than what it was when I was a kid. I'm not enough of a math nerd to know how different the Common Core math standards are, but anyway, so it's a the group tries to be very professional, very neutral, tries to stay out of but there's no way to do standardization without it becoming political. Like every attempt to say, here's what kids in this state should know, people are always going to look at that and say, you left out this thing. And that's like my first challenge here. So this is like, for a social studies teacher, here's things that we're always up against. It's like a balancing act on these things: coverage, skill building, political climate, citizenship. Like the coverage thing, this is a decision like every history teacher has to make every single year. Is what I have to cover everything from 1491 to the present. I don't have time to cover every single thing from 1491 to the present. So I have to make a decision every year, which things am I going to emphasize? And that's where I'm a Civil War nerd. Like I think there's certain things that should be taught in a Civil War class. Somebody else might be a huge Andrew Jackson nerd, and I might not. I don't skip Andrew Jackson, but I might not spend as much time on Andrew Jackson as my colleague would, and we'll end up arguing about you're spending too little time, you're spending too much time on that thing. So that's something you walk into any social studies classroom anywhere, you're going to hear teachers have opinions about that, about coverage. The state of Minnesota does not say that you have to spend this amount of time on this benchmark, on this unit. So there's flexibility for teachers. The College Board doesn't say that either. The College Board tells you 4 to 6% of the test is going to cover Native Americans prior to Columbus up to Jamestown. 4 to 6% of the test. You decide yourself how much time you want to spend on that. So you want to spend a month, go ahead. But 4 to 6% of the exam is going to be that. So most for the AP teachers, most people will look at these percentages and try to plot their calendar out and say, I probably shouldn't be spending more than 4 to 6% of my calendar year on that particular topic. For people who are not teaching AP, but just looking at the state standards, they would count the number of benchmarks and say, well, there's 50 of these and I have this many weeks. That gives me a week, or a half a week to do each one of these things. So I probably shouldn't be spending 2 weeks on this one thing. And if I really think it's important, I would say it would be important for a Mankato teacher to spend a little extra time on the Dakota War because of how important it is to our area. But if you make that decision, then you have to look at another place that you would go a little bit faster through. So you have to make decisions about depth and breadth, like that cartoon, like what hill are you going to die on? Where are you going to stake your ground and say, this is the thing that my kids are going to know? And that's tricky. So you're not going to find agreement, 100% agreement on that just within people within the building. You're not going to find agreement on that across town, and then you're not going to find agreement on that throughout the state. So that's why there's always so many battles on that. The second challenge for history teachers is skill building of like how much should we focus on content? How much should we focus on skills? You know, so reading and writing versus just factual recall, multiple choice tests. And the day and age that we're in, like the title of this book, like, why learn history when it's already on your phone? When a kid can look up just about anything, when they can Google it, you know, so what is the purpose of a history class in this day and age? What should we assess students on? Like that, again, contentious. So there is some value in knowing dates. You know, if you can't, if you have roughly no idea when the American Revolution happened, when the Civil War happened, maybe you don't know the right year, but can you put it in the right century? Can you put it in the right decade? Having some, you know, so there is some value in that, but how much? Like how much time should you spend on that? How much testing should you do on that? That's a question. The political climate, like I think this upcoming year I've never had more anxiety about going into my classroom than this upcoming year. I feel like I have a giant bullseye on my back, and I'm gonna have, I'm really not worried about the students. I don't, like, I've found that I'll have kids in my classroom who have very different opinions. I've had incredibly liberal students, I've had incredibly conservative students, and I've found that they are, you know, when we get into it, that they're pretty open about, okay, I might disagree with this historian's interpretation of this event, but you know, I'm a mature student, I can go forward. I'm not gonna like drop out of your class because you asked me to read this one historian who I would disagree with. So I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about parents and community members who are gonna make demands about transparency, and you know, a teacher has very limited amount of time in their day, and I've already seen a movement in some states where parents are writing emails to teachers demanding that they essentially like digitize their whole curriculum, share everything for the whole year. I want to know every single reading you're going to ask my son or daughter to do. I want to know every video you're going to assign. I want to know it before the start of the year, and I'm going to tell you which of these my child is going to opt out of. And like that's, I don't know how should anybody respond to a situation like that. That's a lot of work to act, you know, it's a lot of labor to ask somebody for. But anyway, this group, I've already mentioned them, Center for the American Experiment, has probably been the most visible, the most vocal. They traveled the state, they came to Mankato, and they were, you know, trying to get people to offer feedback about the first draft of the standards. Second draft came out, I think, last week. They've had a couple blog posts so far about that, but they'll be active. Like they're going to be really encouraging parents, local community members to go to school board meetings, to contact social studies teachers. In previous history wars, I feel like a teacher at the high school, middle school, elementary level, we've been insulated and isolated from it. The bullseye has never been on us. You know, in the 90s, the bullseye was on the Smithsonian. It was on the committee of professors who all were renowned people and they had secure jobs, and it was on Gary Nash. You know, what does he care if there's some op-eds written about him? Like, he's not going to lose his job. So, but this is the first time I feel like where there's been a lot of bullseyes on the back of demanding, like, you know, or making accusations about high school teachers and middle school teachers and elementary teachers, and more so than any other history war up until this moment in time. There's been, and then there's this other challenge where critical race theory, there's groups out there. This is just a screenshot of a tweet from Texas where they're giving people a list of 21 things and saying, if you see this word come up in your school, if you see this word on a kid's worksheet, if you see this word in a textbook, if you see this word on a district publication, it is critical race theory. And so, you know, how do you, for a teacher, how do you respond to stuff like this? Like, this is something that a lot of teachers are starting to think about this summer. How do I respond to any of this stuff when this is pushed out online? So I know that this is a hot issue in the news right now, so I did want to offer a moment in time to like question, and I can maybe try to clarify some stuff if you have questions about this. Critical race theory questions or Center for American Experiment questions.
Other than I do not see anything wrong with students disagreeing and agreeing, especially in history. There can be many causes for one thing. It's, I don't know how we got to the ending result that we can't just accept that in each other.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to remind myself of is if the history wars that we're in right now, maybe I'll jump to my fourth point here, is that I think whether you're on the left or on the right, is like you recognize that the history class is a good vehicle to promote citizenship. And there's just concerns about, is this the best path? What the path that you've selected, the curriculum that you've picked, is it the best way to achieve this goal, this value? But you're seeing, I guess what I'm trying to remind myself is there's still some agreement on this value, that a social studies class and a history class should have some connection to a democratic education, to a civic education, that it should do something to try to enhance citizenship skills among students. But there's just concern about, what curriculum is the best way to go about doing that. And that's something that's been debated amongst social studies teachers, history teachers for a century. It's like, what is the best way to promote citizenship? So on one hand, even though this stuff is causing a lot of anxiety for me over the summer, one thing that I do, there is a glimmer of hope in all this. For my whole career, social studies has been ignored. It's been put on the back burner. There's been less and less of it at the elementary level. A lot of elementary teachers have, because of statewide testing, have really just math and reading they just eat up so much time in an elementary classroom, and social studies has really taken a back seat. And a lot of that has to do with the state testing mandates, but also this whole notion that the point of a school is to promote college and career readiness. And you maybe hear that phrase a lot, college and career readiness. But I think as a social studies teacher, what I'm always trying to remind people, my administration, other people I work with, is that like the original point of a public school, this goes back to one of the questions I asked you earlier about why require history. The original point of a public school was to promote like citizenship. So we've been focused so much on college and career readiness, and just focusing on the needs of an individual kid, but forgetting about the needs of a larger community. Like, why would any member of Mankato vote in favor of a referendum if they don't have kids in the building, if the building is only focused on getting this one individual kid ready for their college or their career? Yeah, you could say there's an economic benefit, that kid gets a better career and it helps the tax base of the town, but there has to be some citizenship component to that this kid is going to come out of the school building and care more about their community and want to be more involved in their community and participate more in their community. Like, the civic health of a community is like, I think the public school has a role in that. I think all the different sides involved in this debate recognize that. And so if there's one glimmer of hope that could come out of this, it's maybe that we would get back to a little bit more of an understanding that like civic education is important, that social studies plays a role in that. The kids it's okay for kids to engage in debate about that. So I guess this is a chart that I think nicely, for me, visualizes what we're seeing as the clash of the current moment. I think people both understand that social studies class should promote civic education, but maybe we just have different ideas about the best pathway to do that. And so we might have one group that's saying the way to do that is to focus on American exceptionalism, founding documents, citizenship tests, go about doing things that way. And then another group might be saying the best way to do that is by promoting civil rights, social justice, civic action projects, social protest, political action. They're disagreeing on the means, but they agree on the end goal there. So
how do you get them to?
I don't know. Boy, that's the $1 million question right now, right?
What I mean.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess you try to find instances where you've maybe seen people like here. Okay, so here's a quote I put in: George W. Bush, Republican president, saying something that I think you would sound more like a Democrat today, which would be, a great nation does not hide from its history, it faces its flaws and corrects them. He said that at the dedication of when the Smithsonian opened the African American History Museum that sits on the National Mall. So he gave a keynote there. That's a powerful quote. So I don't know. It's trying to have conversations like this, and get people. It seems like when people sit down and actually talk to each other, I think you can find areas of agreement. And that's why I think institution like Vine is so important, but just public spaces. Whereas when people are in, most of this debate is playing out in the comment section of a Facebook news article, and people just have no, they're not thinking about the person that's on the other end of that. And they're not thinking about their background, their experience, and there's just no attempt to hear each other out. I don't know. It's concerning.
A lot of assumptions being made too.
Yeah.
People who are arguing for something, they're asked about it and they can't even tell you what that includes.
That's become, I don't even know how to even talk about critical race theory anymore, because it's like everything, then I don't know what it is then, if it's everything.
Exactly is
Yeah.
critical race
Okay, so
theory?
maybe here's what I would, if we're in a history class and I'm asking kids, if we're trying to figure out, let's say Civil War, I'm a Civil War nerd. If we're trying to figure out why the South seceded, how should we go about figuring that out? Should we go to the textbook? Okay, we go to a textbook, but that's one historian's interpretation. That's a secondary source. Ideally, we'd want to go to a primary source. We'd want to maybe see if we can find the Southerners who seceded themselves and see what they wrote. And it turns out that they did, right? When every Southern state seceded, they had a secession convention. They published a declaration of why they were seceding. They all signed their names to it. And so we can go back and we can read those, and figure out why the South seceded. So for critical race theory, I'd probably do this, I encourage people to do the same thing. If we want to figure out what critical race theory is, we should probably figure out, okay, well, who came up with this idea and what did they say when they were coming up with it? So we'd go to the primary sources. The names that keep coming up in the news: Delgado is a Harvard law school professor who's kind of the person whose name you'll hear. Kimberly Crenshaw is a name you're going to hear a lot. There is Gloria Lansden-Billings is another name. So when you go back, what you find is that there's even some disagreement amongst those people. I'm one person will say it's got 5 components. Another person will, these are the founders of it. Another person will say it's got 4 components. There seems to be some agreement on some things, on what critical race theory originally was intended to be. But I guess what I was concerned by this, because I think this is a distortion of, this is making claims about it that I don't think it's not what the people who came up with it said it was. So, and so what I've heard, this group had a YouTube video that they posted recently where, people will ask, are you teaching critical race theory? They'll ask me as a teacher, they'll call downtown, are you teaching critical race theory in your school? And we can, no, I had seen the phrase. I do a lot of reading. I'm probably the nerdiest history teacher at Mankato West. I read a ton. I try to, and I was vaguely familiar with the phrase prior to this prior to 2021. I had maybe seen it in passing. So I had never approached a classroom with the intent of I'm going to frame this lesson from our critical race theory point of view. I'm going to try to get my kids to become critical race theorists. Never done any of that. So I can say that to people. School districts can say that to people. We're not doing that. We have never sat down and as a team of teachers developed documents like this where we say, all right, let's take the benchmarks and now let's take a critical race theory look at them and let's interpret them from a critical race theory lens. Never happened in ISD 77. So you can tell that to people, but then what this YouTube video was saying is that these social studies teachers are ignorant. They don't even know that they're doing it. They've been brainwashed, and instead, and so that's why they're giving people these lists. It's like, if your son or daughter comes home with something that says systemic racism, microaggression, anti-racism identity, then critical race theory is happening in your school. Your teacher is just too ignorant to know that it's happening. And I feel like that's pretty insulting to me. Like, I have a pretty extensive background of courses that I've taken. I don't want to go through my brag sheet, but I feel like I've done a lot of reading and a lot more reading than some of the parents. I've definitely done more reading than the kids I have in the classroom. I've had some pretty prestigious professors at MSU. I've had their children in my class. They've done way more reading on certain aspects of history than I have, but I feel like I try to read as much as I humanly possibly can. I feel like I come into the classroom very prepared, knowledgeable. So when somebody tells me that I'm ignorant of something, it's I don't know, it's insulting, demeaning a little bit. And that's why I feel this anxiety of like, I don't know what to say in response to that then. How do if I tell you that I'm not doing this, you tell me that I am, what could I possibly tell you next then? What do you need to hear? What does a person need to hear or see in order to believe that I guess what I'm trying to share with them, a claim that I'm trying to share with them? I feel like I've got a claim, I've got evidence to back my claim, I've got my scope and sequence here, but I've got my national objectives that I have to follow. Like that's what I'm using. So I don't know. So yeah, that's what I have. Social studies teachers I know, and the first week we all come back together, we're already, there's going to be a lot of concern about like, what should we do as a department? How should we handle this climate that we're in right now? A lot of anxiety. So
Have to write it out.
we're gonna only way out is through, right?
Right,
Yeah,
that's right.
we're gonna get through it. And a lot of people are really looking forward to this next school year because like finally we don't have to do half the kids in the classroom and half at home, and half at home never coming to the online meet. So there was a lot to look forward to about this fall, but there will be some anxiety. I don't know, maybe it'll die down. Maybe we'll find some new thing to get outraged about. And then we'll move on to that. But I don't know. Yeah. What other questions do we have? Because those are the challenges. And then after that, I just had time for Q&A.
You've done a good job answering them as they come along.
Yes, I think so too.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I hope, thank you for letting me share. And I kind of use this as an opportunity to try to like do I knew I was going to have to like address this at the start of the school year. So I use this as like, all right, I got to do my homework right now.
Okay.
Let's start thinking about this. That's good. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.